Right. Yeah, both. Thank you. It's nice to hear you applaud beforehand. You never know whether you're going to applaud afterwards. Well, welcome to this evening's program. We'll go ahead and get started. The Contract with America, a conversation with conservatives. My name is John Shaw, and I've been asked to moderate this evening's discussion and act as a referee for these remarks regarding the Republican Revolution. I am a fellow here at the Institute of Politics, and in my previous incarnations served as a domestic policy advisor in the Bush White House, and then as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Department of Labor. I also was the Republican candidate for the United States Congress in Michigan's 13th District last year. Indeed, I think I was available to do this gig tonight because I was just about the only Republican in the country who didn't get elected. Nonetheless, my colleagues successfully did so and set this revolution into place. We are joined this evening by two terrific individuals whom I want to introduce to you. First of all, on my right, Frank Luntz. Frank graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with an honors Bachelor of Arts degree in history and political science, and he received his doctorate in politics at the ripe old age of 25 from Oxford University. 2 years ago, in the spring of 1993, Frank was a fellow here at the Institute of Politics. A couple of quotes from the media about Frank Luntz and what he means to the world of polling and politics. Time magazine recently named Frank Luntz as one of, quote, the 50 most promising national leaders under age 40. USA Today labeled him one of the 9 most influential minds in the GOP, and the Washington Times called him the most quoted Republican pollster in America. Frank has been seen everywhere on television. You almost can't turn on the dial without seeing him. Nightline, Crossfire, MacNeil Lehrer, This Week with David Brinkley, The Today Show, Inside Politics. He's done them all. But he was also credited as being the first pollster to predict a Republican majority on John McLaughlin's One-on-One show. And of course, Dr. Frank Luntz was the pollster of record for the Contract with America, and that's why it is especially terrific to have him with us this evening. Our other guest on my left is Tom Korologos, and I want to say a few things about Tom, who is a Republican institution himself of credit for a few decades now. He earned his BA at the University of Utah and his master's degree at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, and in fact started his career as a journalist with the New York Herald Tribune, the Long Island Press, the Associated Press, and the Salt Lake Tribune. Tom, in the 1970s, for 4 years, was in the Nixon and Ford White House as the Deputy Assistant to the President for Senate Relations. And in 1975, Tom Korologos and others founded the Timmons and Company, of which he serves as president. And for those of you familiar with inside the Beltway, Washington, Timmons and Company is one of the preeminent Republican government relations consulting firms. He has held a number of government positions, far too numerous to list, but I will just say that he was former chairman of the United States Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, and his diplomatic assignments have sent him to countries virtually on every continent. I also have to tweak him a little bit, because having said all that, Tom is no longer the most famous Korologos. His daughter, Paula Korologos, some of you may have seen the newest addition to the television show Murphy Brown. And Tom, I have to credit you. What a clever way to start delivering the conservative message in the liberals' famous sitcom through Murphy Brown with your daughter. So we are delighted to have Tom with us tonight. Before I let our two speakers give their insights into the Contract with America, I do want to just take a couple of moments and give an overview myself. Incidentally, one other member of the panel who is not with us tonight, Congressman Rick Lazio of New York, was supposed to be here. But as the afternoon wore on, the House Budget Committee did not end their meeting, and they are continuing to meet even as we speak. I just came from up there yesterday, and I will tell you, for a week in which the House of Representatives isn't even yet back convened, they don't come back in until next week, there isn't a lot of activity going on in Washington this week. A lot of that activity is in one word, the budget. That's what's happening in the House. Members have been working all week and have been meeting into the evening, and they're meeting as we speak. The Senate, which is in session, has pretty much faced the same situation. On the Senate Budget Committee side, Senator Pete Domenici was supposed to open hearings today, and in fact delayed them because the senators are having their own little debates internally, and certainly the Republicans are, about the budget and about tax cuts. So it is interesting to have this conversation as we're having it tonight, because as we move into the next stage of this, over the next few months, budget is where the action is. And I'll tell you, perhaps Betty Davis said it best, fasten your seatbelts, ladies and gentlemen, it's going to be a bumpy ride, because that's where we're going with the budget. The contract with America, and it is in fact above me, we decided, since not everybody has memorized all the items that are in the contract, it'd be useful to have them displayed above us as we're talking about them and to have them passed out to all of you. In fact, you see they have. I should say this has been a very hard-working House of Representatives since it's convened in January. I was one of the 386 Americans who signed the contract with America on the steps of the United States Capitol last September 27th. And it has been amazing to see what the Republicans in the House of Representatives have managed to do in just these 4 months. Numbers say a lot, and you can lie with numbers, but they're interesting to look at. If you look at pages in the congressional record to see what this House of Representatives has done, it's compiled 4,000 pages of record. That compares same time period in the last Congress, 2 years ago, the 103rd Congress, of 1,100 pages. This House of Representatives, in those first 93 days, were in session for 486 hours versus 189 hours for the same counterpart period in Congress 2 years ago. And among votes, they've had 209 roll call votes versus only 42 roll call votes in that same period 2 years ago. Quantity certainly does not indicate success, quality does, and that's where the contract comes into play. As you'll see with the items displayed, and I think the ones we've passed out to you, just to remind everybody a little bit of what's in them, and I'm just going to briefly go through them and then turn to our speakers. Budget, and this is budget reform, because obviously now we'll move to budget in terms of spending cuts and tax cuts. The balanced budget amendment and the line item veto. Legal reforms, limits on punitive damages and product liability reform. Incidentally, I will say that all of these items have been brought up in the House of Representatives, and with the exception of term limits, all passed the House of Representatives, and some have already gone to action in the Senate, some have remained to have action in the Senate, and that's what we'll talk about tonight. Congressional reform was a whole series of reforms that the House passed on day one in that marathon session, very unusual in history to do that, meeting until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Crime prevention, now very much back on the front burner because of events in Oklahoma City last week. The middle class tax cut, a tax credit of $500 per child, beginning to repeal the marriage penalty tax, and American Dream savings accounts. Some cats and dogs associated with senior citizens, to raise the Social Security earnings limit and to repeal the 1993 tax increases under Bill Clinton. Term limits, as I mentioned. Some national security components about defense spending, and a policy in terms of U.S. troops under UN command. A whole series of issues that relate to children and families. Adoption, child support enforcement, child pornography laws. A lot of items that tend to get forgotten when people talk about the contract. Welfare reform, certainly one of the most controversial elements of the Republicans' package that has gained perhaps the most attention in these 4 months and remains to be decided from this point out. And just as a reminder to many of you, the House has passed it, the Senate needs to act, but Bill Clinton said on national television last week he wants a welfare reform bill by the 4th of July. So it's going to be an interesting, hot summer when it comes to welfare reform. And finally, regulatory reform that has a whole series of policies associated with it, capital gains tax cut, a moratorium on new regulations, and of course, the unfunded mandates bill, which not only passed the House, but also the Senate, and has already been signed into law by the President. That's tripping over the landscape lightly of what is in the contract with America. 10 items that, when you look at it, are in fact 31 separate legislative items to be tracked, and we have been doing so for those of you who've been associated with our study group here on the contract with America. With that very quick overview, I am going to invite the insights of our two distinguished guests this evening, after which time we will certainly open it up for questions from all of you. As you will see, there are microphones on both sides, and though you might want to do it from your chair, since we do tape every event that goes on in the forum, it helps our technicians a lot if you will go over to the microphones and do it that way, so we'll have you do that. But before we get to questions, let me give as much time as both Frank and Tom want to give us. And Frank, I'm going to turn to you first for your insights, because your name may not be on the contract, but your fingerprints are all over it. You were integrally involved with the development of the contract with America at every stage from the beginning through today. And how has it played? And is it what you expected? And where are we today?
Well, it certainly has changed my life to a great degree. I have a former Penn student of mine in the audience right now, and I never wore a tie. And one of the things that I've really resented about the last 4 or 5 months is I actually have to put on a suit on occasion. We did a survey back in January of 1994, and we asked the question, who do you trust and respect more? It was actually, who do you have more trust and confidence in, politicians or prostitutes? And I kid you not, that was the question we asked. We are always doing things like this. Since I'm paying for the surveys, I figure I can ask different kinds of questions. Last month we asked the question, would you want your son and daughter to grow up to be just like Bill Clinton? Only 16% said yes. That is an all-time low for a president. It's even worse than what Richard Nixon got during the height of Watergate. So we asked this question to kind of see what the public mood was. I mean, everyone keeps talking about the public being angry and frustrated and bitter and annoyed and just aggravated. 58% chose politicians as having more faith and trust. 19% said, and this is a volunteer response, that they couldn't tell the difference, or that there was no difference. And 17% came up with prostitutes having more trust and confidence in. And so we had a follow-up question, an open-ended question. We asked them, why do you have more faith and confidence in them? And the response was, because at least you get a service for the money you pay. And that was the mood. That was the frustration. I was here back in October. And there was a certain point where I actually was not looking forward to coming back here, where I tried to explain what was going on in America, and people were hissing and booing and just otherwise fidgeting and complaining. And I said, just listen. Understand what's going on the other side, so if you disagree with it, you will be articulate in your opposition to it. And I talked about sending power back to the states and localities, and that was an unheard of concept in this forum. I talked about the idea of less government, less responsibility in Washington, and more responsibility to the individual, which rubbed about 80% of the audience the wrong way. And I said that you gotta feel the mood, the desire for people to take back their lives and to have less control over themselves. The contract in itself was not a gimmick to me. It was authored by Speaker Gingrich, by Majority Leader Armey, and by the other Republicans who were running for office. I don't know if you filled out a survey, but if you got a survey, we produced that survey asking members and challengers what they wanted, what the public wanted, what they were interested in. It's the first time in American history that people who were not holding office but were running had a chance to have input. If you wanted to prove that you were different, you have to do different things. If you wanted to attempt to restore confidence in government, you have to keep your promises. If you wanted to reattach the relationship that the public has with their elected officials, you gotta do something bold. And the contract was absolutely trashed from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to Los Angeles, California, on the editorial pages of the newspapers across the country. But the heartland of America was looking for something like this. We were much less involved, my firm and myself, than we are given credit for. I don't begrudge it. It allowed me to buy a new sport coat. But we don't deserve the credit. The credit goes to people who signed it, to people who believed in it, and to people who campaigned on it. Look at it this way. 9 out of the 10 items passed the House. Everything that was promised in the contract was done. Everything was brought up for a vote. There had never been a term limit vote in the history of Congress. All the balanced budget amendments were frauds until now. This is a serious reform and transformation of welfare, a tough crime bill, changes in the regulatory system and legal system. This is fundamental change, and that's exactly what 70% of Americans were looking for. Tom, the problem I have is I spent a semester here, so every time I come up here, I get defensive.
Same.
When I first got up here, I was like, this is Harvard, and let's have a real good debate. And most of the times when I've come to present these types of items, it's been very hostile. And so I want to leave it at that, and I'd prefer much more to answer your questions and to engage in a dialogue. But don't take this as a cynical document, because no one who signed it was cynical about it. People believed in it. Staff people in the Hill have been working 100 hours a week, and I exaggerate not, 100 hours a week, sometimes more, to change the way Washington works. And it's begun. And it may only be a small step, but certainly people do not look at Congress today the way they looked at it 6 months ago or a year ago when I did that survey. Things have begun to change, and for that I'm grateful, and for that I'm proud and optimistic about the future.
Thank you, Frank, for those insights. It does remind me of a personal experience I found after having signed the contract with America on September 27th. And that was, by the time the election came around on November 8th, I wouldn't say that there were loads of people, in my district who knew what was in the contract with America. It's not like they rattled off the 10 items right off the top of their head. It wasn't that at all. But there was definitely a very pronounced sentiment about something that Frank alluded to, and that is there were certainly voters who very powerfully were aware of the fact that the Republican Party, 6 weeks before an election, was willing to stand up and say to the American people, here are the 10 things we stand for. Take it, read it, study it, do whatever you want with it. But decide whether or not you agree and vote for us or vote for the other guys. And by November 8th, it was very clear that voters throughout the district, and I suspect throughout America, were very aware that the Republican Party was willing to stand up and do that, as opposed to the other party, which did not do so. I'm going to turn to Tom Korologos for his overview. Tom, some people have said that 1995 has already emerged as a very important year in being a fundamental shift in American government. And there are only a few other years in this century you can think of similar things happening. 1935, certainly. 1965 with the Great Society. In 1981, perhaps, with the Reagan Revolution. And now maybe 1995. Your historical perspective is perhaps as good as anyone's. How important is the contract with America now, and what happens from this point forward?
Well, in the first place, first let me say about my daughter Paula on Murphy Brown. When she got her part, she called me up and she said, I'm on Murphy Brown. The first thing I did is call Quayle. And I said, guess, and he knew Paula when she was a page in the Senate. And I said, guess where Paula is working? And he said, oh, I can't believe it. He said, it's better, she should have got on a porno show. That's outrageous. She shouldn't be on it. So we've had some pretty good time, and she's the conservative foil on the show. And one of the scenes, how'd I get on this? In one of the scenes, she gets thrown out of the White House for getting in a fight with Murphy Brown, and as she's leaving the White House, she says, we'll be back, 2 years max is all you got left. And so she's doing right well. Well, thank you. I appreciate the chance to come and be with you and talk a little bit about the contract and what it all means. First of all, I refer to the contract as the American Dream Restoration Act, Frank. So from this Republican standpoint, I think it's really a historic thing. One of the other things I should say to everyone here is I'm a Senate specialist. I don't know anything about the House. They're all too young. They look like pages. They scare me. So I'm strictly a Senate creature. I specialize in government affairs in the Senate side. I think the lead in the story, as we journalists used to say it, on the contract, is the fact that it happened at all. The fact that the Republicans all hung together and picked up a few strays here and there, and it happened. And it happened in less than 100 days. Now, can you imagine we're making a big deal out of a bunch of politicians keeping their word? That's also amazing. And the contract proved, at least to me, that ideas do matter. Here was for the first time in the memory of man, a party signed a contract nationwide. And Frank and all of the House people were excoriated. You cannot run a national election. Tip O'Neill from up here said all politics is local. Well, Frank and Newton, all of them proved that you can have a national agenda. And it worked. And there's no mystery in the contract. There it is. It's free enterprise, it's strong defense, it's traditional values, and it's individual freedom. And, you know, sorry, Peter Jennings, the election was not akin to a 2-year-old throwing a temper tantrum like he said that night. And ideas matter, and ideas have consequences, doggone it, and these guys proved it. But what it did, it set the stage for the most fundamental changes that we have ever seen in my lifetime in Washington, and I got there in 1962. It reorders the federal budget, major sweeping review and reconstruction of 60 years of social welfare policy. And I'm really not exaggerating when I liken it to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. And Washington will indeed never be the same. We can talk on individual things that have happened regarding how this town operates. But what happens now? Whether the contract, where are we now? In the Senate side at least. And the short answer is nobody knows. The longer answer is that Senates, by definition, and by design of the Founding Fathers and inclination and tradition, Senates go slow. Senates are more methodical than Houses. Senates follow Corologus's first law of Congress. Congresses do two things best, don't forget. Congresses do nothing and overreact. And given that, and that's one of the reasons God made Senates, is to cool the legislative passion. It is entirely consistent with what the Founding Fathers and the drafters of the Constitution had when they created the House and the Senate. And in the first place, the Senate did not sign the contract. They had pieces of it. Bob Byrd reminds us that of every day, that there was no signature. He wasn't on the contract. So we have what the Pentagon calls, those of you who have been poking around Washington, a KUNK, K-U-N-K. We have a known unknown. We know that we don't know what's going to happen. And for you Pentagon junkies, they also have unkunks in the Pentagon, which is an unknown unknown. We can go on for that for a while, too. Dominating everything in the Senate for the next little while, the next weeks and months, will be the budget. They're hell-bound to balance the budget by 2002. Numbers 1 through 10 on the Senate agenda is the balance the budget. And it's going to take $1 trillion in cuts over the next 7 years. And like John said and Frank alluded to, you ain't seen nothing yet on this budget cut. This business with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, that's a piece of cake compared to what you can see coming. And wait until that process starts. The political howling is going to be something to hear. The other stuff in the Senate agenda, and Dole wants to get a little ahead of the House. He doesn't want to play follow-on to everything. He's got massive rewrites of banking laws, public housing policies, farm programs, reduction in regulations, telecommunications reform, and even this minute, right now at 7:30 tonight, the Senate is debating the product liability reform laws that change all that. And we haven't even mentioned the old standbys, social issues, immigration reform, affirmative action, abortion, school prayer, welfare reform. And as a result of Oklahoma, we've got the new big debate going on down there today. The short piece of it is giving up some freedoms for safety. Where do you draw the line? On how far do you go? And the other thing, don't forget about the Senate is one person's gridlock is another person's good government. You know, where is it written that everything on the calendar has to pass? The tendency among legislative minorities is to band together for the common good. And as we Republicans did in '94, we blocked health care reform, taxpayer financing political campaigns, the overregulation of America. That was gridlock. Oh, how awful. And the only difference, and I'm going to show my bias to some of the media, is that when the Democrats start doing that, what we have, as has happened in the Senate, we have a prudent check on an arrogant majority to stop the steamroller tactics by that wacko partisan demon devil incarnate Newt Gingrich. So you've heard a lot about the first 100 days. I think what's going to matter is the last 100 days. The 100 days between the conventions in August and the election. And if the public perception is during those 100 days that the Republicans tried, they made some fundamental changes, Maybe not everything, maybe not quite perfect, but by golly, they are making a difference. And that's going to be the final pass grade in the voting booth in '96. And I have a bunch of predictions, but I won't take your time for them now, except for one. Do not underestimate the capacity of the Republican Party to screw this up. And with that, let's go to see what's on your minds.
Thank you, Tom. We definitely want to open up to questions, and as you see, there is a microphone on the left and on the right. So please come to either side and do so, and speak into the microphone. Tell us who you are, perhaps what your Harvard affiliation is, and if you want to direct the question to someone in particular, that is certainly more than acceptable. And being a Republican, I am going to indulge my prerogative to start on what's my right and go over here on this side.
Hello, my name is Judd Sirota. I'm a first-year law student at Harvard Law School. And
Condolences.
I have actually two questions that I'd be interested in hearing all of your reactions to, and one in particular I'd like to hear Mr. Luntz respond to. One of the things that actually we were studying at the law school while it was being debated in the House was the modification to the exclusionary rule. And I was looking very, very closely, very carefully at papers like the New York Times and the Boston Globe, looking for something, anything that gave the rationale for revising the exclusionary rule. And I didn't find anything. What I did find were things in the New York Times that asked, do you support the requirement of a warrant for a search? Which of course has nothing to do with the modifications to the exclusionary rule, but and 80% of course supported the requirement of a warrant, and this showed that people were against the exclusionary rule. So first of all, I'd like to hear your reaction to the way that played, and because I think that if people actually knew what it was, it would be overwhelmingly popular. And second of all, I was wondering if you could talk...
This is why lawyers are so popular in America today.
Just very quickly. Second of all, I was wondering if you could give us some sort of perspective on where the so-called religious right is, how the religious right, the media's fascination with Pat Robertson and people like that is going to play in next year's election.
Whenever I think of the exclusionary rule, I always first think of the religious right, and then it usually goes from there. I'm not, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Were you following the contract through the last couple months of '94?
Yeah, I was.
What has your opinion been of Congress since Election Day? Has Congress acted better than you expected or worse than you expected?
Oh, much better.
Are you Republican or Democrat?
I'm a Republican.
And you're happy with what's happened?
I'm very happy with the test.
Is there anything that's disappointed you? See, you're taught in law to answer questions really quickly and succinctly. He hasn't given me more than a 3-word answer, but his questions take 5 minutes.
The one thing that I haven't actually been happy with is some of the public relations involved. I think that a lot of people, Newt Gingrich especially, were really blindsided by a lot of the criticism that was bound to be levied at them. And there were some things, especially, for example, on the exclusionary rule, that they were not at all prepared to handle.
This really keeps you up at night, doesn't it? I'm going to leave the policy. I will explain to you public opinion on the crime issue. Clinton's got it right when he talks about putting more police on the street. And the Republicans have been pushing the Democrats about this for years. And it's amazing because I do give the president credit for understanding the mood of America, even if he doesn't always act it out in his policies. The frustration, and Tom is deeply involved in the whole concept of legal reform, is that there are too many people getting off on technicalities, that there are too many opportunities for clearly guilty people to have the opportunity to walk. Now, those on the other side would say, but that's what our system's about. I mean, it really is about defending the rights of the criminal. Well, the public, well, I always call the ACLU the American Criminal Liberties Union, rather than understand, though, that the public is scared to walk the streets at night. They are scared in their homes. They are afraid for their children. This is why, I mean, in Washington, if you've got any money at all, and I'm sure the same happens in a lot of areas in Boston, you don't send your kids to public schools. You send them to private schools. It's not just the quality of the education, it's you're afraid for your own child's safety. And so anything that addresses that, which the exclusionary rule does, is going to be supported because the feeling is you've just got to get these people off the streets. Prevention hasn't worked. Social programs haven't worked. Welfare hasn't stopped the crime in many areas. Many people argue that it has actually increased the crime, so get them off the street. And stop letting people walk free because of technicalities. And that's where the public stands on it. And I'd rather wait to answer your religious right question until they respond
then let's
to this.
just finish off the exclusionary rule, because it to me is one example of how this Republican revolution is not revolutionary. It is revolutionary in that it was a party willing to state to the American public what it stands for and then to keep those promises. But there's almost no idea of those ideas up there that is in any way new, and the exclusionary rule proposal is certainly one that's not. I remember in 1987, as a young staffer in the House of Representatives working on the crime bill back in those years, when we were trying to put in the good faith exception to the exclusionary rule, coming out of some Supreme Court rulings many years ago. But Tom, do you want to?
Go ahead.
In its simplest context, without getting into lawyer talk here, and I'm not a lawyer, so that if in the course of an investigation a police officer is searching for evidence that he can search for underneath that warrant, but finds evidence for a crime that was not specifically delineated in the warrant, under the good faith exception, now, if you pass a law, that evidence would be admissible. I think in its simplest, that's the Republican proposal. And that's been hanging out there for many, many years. The only difference now is now Republicans with enough votes are in a position perhaps to change the law. And I think it goes exactly to what Frank said, and that's anything that empowers us as a society to get criminals off the street. And I think that's where it is.
The only thing I would add is that
You're saying that presently now, you have a warrant and you search, and you find something unrelated to the warrant, not introduced it? Incorrect.
Can I?
Sure, I will let
just
our
learned.
law students jump in here.
Just learned it. I hope I know it. Basically, the way the exclusionary rule works is presently, because this is not signed into law yet, the way the exclusionary rule works is if there is evidence that is found that is not that is determined to be illegal because there's no warrant or something like that, the evidence is not admissible. For those of you who've been following the O.J. Simpson trial, you know all about the hopping the wall and that sort of thing. Under the Republicans' modification to the exclusionary rule, if a police officer finds something that he in good faith believes to be something that's not required, it's not required to have a warrant, or that he in good faith believes that it's covered by the warrant, then it would be admissible. The idea is to get more evidence into the hands of the prosecution and have, as you said, fewer technicalities.
But the only thing I would add is, given what's happened in Oklahoma, and today there was a hearing, and there's going to be a markup in the Senate Judiciary Committee to report out a, quote, terrorism bill, to which the Republicans are going to add all those amendments that were knocked out of the crime bill last year when it was rammed down their throat. And you're going to see exclusionary rule, you're going to see habeas corpus, you're going to see death penalty, you're going to see all of those things that at one time the repeal of the assault rifles was on it, but I think that has faded off now given what happened in Oklahoma. Even the NRA decided not to do that one. You're going to see a whole rewrite and a whole package of crime legislation. And I think the Senate's going to do it probably right after product liability. I don't think telecommunications is ready. So it's coming, and it's coming fast.
Frank, do you want to talk about the religious right before we?
Sure, and I don't mean to give you a hassle. The idea that you would stand up at Harvard and acknowledge, particularly in the law school, that you're a Republican deserves accommodation, so congratulations.
To stick together.
When you need a job in Washington, let me know. The religious right, tough issue, because most Americans now hold to the beliefs that what I would call religious conservatives rather than religious right. Most Americans, 70, 75, even approaching 80%, actually agree with the point of view of religious conservatives. School prayer now is supported by somewhere around 75% of Americans. And there are very, very few tiny pockets of those who oppose it right now. The only demographic group that you can segment that opposes school prayer are Jews. Blacks are the most supportive, Latinos second most. And actually, this is one of the few issues politically where the Jewish population and the black population disagree. On issues such as welfare, crime, education, there's really been a redefinition of what is a social issue. And in a sense, what is a religious conservative. Right now, there is a segment of the Jewish population, which is basically the Orthodox segment, that is now voting Republican more than they vote Democrat. You don't see that unless you're in New York City or in certain places in Los Angeles. The problem comes in with extremists, but that happens with any group. And the problem for the GOP is going to be how you can keep a moral component to the policies that you have, which the public is perfectly prepared to do, without imposing a specific morality. That is a very, very tough tightrope. Now, too often, those who would attack Republicans, and this happened with the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, just quick hands, those of you who are Democrats, raise your hand. Let me just say to you that Vic Fazio did you all more damage than any other single individual in 1994, because he went out and attacked religious conservatives for their positions, suggesting that they were going to bring forward some sort of Puritan ethic to America. And what he did in his attack was that he basically ended up attacking everyone who attended church or religious services on a weekly basis. He did more damage because he mobilized people who consider themselves religious, which 70% of Americans do. That there has to be a better way to deal with morality, or with where you disagree on morality, than to criticize the motives of those who believe very deeply in their religion and believe that this country's gone to hell. And right now, the Democrats have not figured out the way to do it. And quite frankly, that's why they lost the election in 1994.
Thank you. Let's move on over to the left so we can get in as many questions as possible.
I don't think my question will be as long as the last one, but you will get many longer questions throughout the evening, I bet. My question is sort of related to the religious right, but it goes on to a larger issue. Now, as Mr. Shaw said, his district, they didn't quote the contract, but they had an idea that the Republican Party definitely had a sort of an agenda, and it was pronounced in it. Reading the news just about every day since the Republican Party took power in Congress, I've noticed that not only have they crammed through the items in the contract, but the issues that they support and other issues have also disseminated down to the states, and that they've been supported by the governors and the state legislatures. So my first part of the question is, how much do you think the Republican contract with America was responsible for the House and for the nation at large, with the state legislatures and the governors? And on a larger issue, do you think, since all the members signed it, basically on the economic terms, that they should take leaps on to social issues such as affirmative action, abortion, etc.? And if they do go on to these social issues, do you think the contract will hold together?
It's an excellent question, and Tom, I'm going to invite you to answer, but it does bring up something that is important and people should keep in mind. All these items were voted on in the House of Representatives. With the exception of term limits, all passed the House of Representatives. Almost all of those items passed the House of Representatives with tremendous majorities. These weren't 100% party line votes. It wasn't party cohesion in that sense. It was party cohesion on the Republican side, because basically all Republicans voted yes. But it wasn't party cohesion on the Democrat side. In fact, if you look at those items, on average, the vote total for each of them was 70%. That means a lot of Democrats voting for items in that contract. So you have a lot of bipartisan support in the House of Representatives, and certainly support that goes well beyond there, as you said, with governors and state legislatures. So it is a contract with America that really has resonated in some sense in several sectors of the American society. Tom, I will let you answer it from there, and then part two of the question with economic issues being part of the contract, where does one go from here on social issues?
Well, first of all, I want to say something about the religious right and the prayer amendment. When it passed, when it was defeated in the Senate last year, somebody came out of the Senate reception room and said, "Thank God they killed the prayer amendment." Well, the contract itself, you know, when you boil it down to legislative language, and all of the things that are listed here on our paper that's been distributed, it is, as I said, it is ideas, it is, and there was a series of events that the members put down to balance the budget, to limit punitive damages, prison construction. All of these things are aimed at the hardcore of America. These are family values. These are ideas. This is that business that I listed here. I was trying to find it. That it's about individual freedom. It's about turning America around. Business as usual is no longer going to happen in this Congress. And all of these things in due course are on the agenda. When they'll happen, who knows? As I said, the Senate goes slow. The Senate takes 60 votes.
Well, a lot of things you mentioned were on the agenda, but things like affirmative action and other such items weren't on the agenda, and they're still being covered.
Those things, not everything has to be contract-wise in order to pass a Senate. They're going to do things that they need to do politically. They're going to do things they need to. The Senate is different. The Senate is going to do its own thing, and there will be some health care proposals. It's not going to be the massive big bill that we saw. My view on health care, you asked that question, is that at the end of the year or the end of in 18 months, somebody's going to wake up and say, "Gee whiz, look at all these things they did." They'll have passed a piece of this, a piece of that, portability, a piece of the problems that have been created, and the fact that health care reform was up in the first place has already created some savings. Already. Now that's a long way of saying it remains to be seen what the Senate's going to do. And there will be some political consequences if the Senate doesn't move as expeditiously as the House. You're going to see a battle between Dole and Graham over this business, and in the next 3 or 4 weeks, you're going to see another battle between Dole and Graham on taxes. And whoever is left standing at the end of that thing, at the beginning of June, could have a real leg up on the Republican nomination. All of the things that are listed in the contract in the you cite.
Affirmative action, by the way, is the nightmare issue for Bill Clinton, because he is caught between two very, very different wings of his party. Jesse Jackson's threatened to run as an independent if Clinton buckles. The group that's led by Senator Lieberman, the more moderate Democrats, have said that we are going to rewrite this. We are not going to be the party that backs the same kind of affirmative action programs we have for the last 20 years. And there is no consensus right now. And so he just wants that issue to go as far away as it can.
Let's go over here to the gentleman with the Colin Powell for President button.
Thank you.
Do you know something we don't know?
Yeah.
I know as much as you know or less. I just have a lot of hope and some reasons to believe. And the button goes directly to my question, and my question is directed to you, Mr. Luntz. Bill Clinton will veto some of the contract, even if the Senate passes it. It may be hard for him in terms of popular support, but the media will trash the contract and predict dire consequences, and he'll have the support of the media if he does veto it. Recognizing that, therefore, that we will need the presidency in order to pass the rest of the contract and much of what else will get through a Republican-dominated Congress, and recognizing that a lot can happen between now and the convention. But with the by far leading Republican candidate for the presidency, Bob Dole, leading the president by only 7 points in the polls, a number of us Republicans are turning toward the man who would be, we are certain, by far the strongest candidate for the presidency. And
Bill
that
Graham?
is General Colin Powell. And my question to you is, since I take it as they can call the election off if Colin Powell gets the nomination. The issue is, can he obtain the Republican nomination?
Perhaps if he were to run, but you can't obtain it if you don't enter it. You know, there's a line that a legal professor once taught me for wherever that Harvard law student went, which is you don't get if you don't ask. And he would have to actually run. I think he'd be a very formidable candidate. When his book comes out in September and he does his 3 or 4 week book tour, there's going to be another groundswell of support for him. And he's not Ross Perot. He is, and I know Perot did actually very well when he's come up to Harvard, but he is very respected by people from, regardless of ideology, regardless of partisan affiliation, but who's to say that he wants it? Who's to say that he's a Republican? Who's to say that he's a conservative? Do we really know where Colin Powell stands?
If he runs as a Republican, and a number of us believe that if he does, if he does run, he will run as a Republican. No other scenario makes very much sense. If he runs as a Republican, can he win the Republican nomination?
I think so.
And you think that because?
Because he is a leader who has a track record of success in very difficult situations. He's got a tremendous image. But again, I want to emphasize, I mean, let me ask you, where does Colin Powell stand on affirmative action? Where does Colin Powell stand on abortion? Where does Colin Powell stand on prayer in schools? Where does Colin Powell stand on welfare reform? Just take that list from up there and go down that list. We really don't know. And until we learn about that, that's the difference between talking about him as a potential candidate and really making someone like him credible. Is the nomination up for grabs? Absolutely. Is Colin Powell destined to get it? Can't really answer that.
As we move back over on this side, feel free to introduce yourselves as you ask your question. You have the advantage over us because you know who you're talking to. We like to know who we're talking to, too. So let's start over here.
Hi, my name is Tom Baelish, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, a Republican, and also I support a lot of what the contract stands for. I'd like to ask Dr. Luntz about the middle-class tax cut. As the party of economic growth, supposedly, I was wondering why the tax credit for the $500 tax credit per child was adopted as opposed to a reduction in the marginal rate of taxation. And I'd wonder why that emerged as the winner in the contract that was formulated.
I can tell you what I think. I don't like the idea that this thing is being filmed. It is from economists I speak with, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but from economists I speak with, it is not one of the better tax cuts there are out there to stimulate the economy, to encourage growth. Although I will tell you that the belief in growth now, that you cut taxes creates growth, is as low as it was when Reagan came into office. That the Democrats have been very successful in undermining that argument. And that things like the expanding IRAs, cutting marginal rates in income taxes, even a capital gains tax has more economic support than the $500 credit. Much of the $500 credit is devoted to enhancing a pro-family platform that says that families should be economically encouraged rather than discouraged. You know, for all of you get married, you're going to find out exactly what government policy is towards families when you suddenly find out that you're paying more money to the government by getting married than you do if you just live with your so-called spouse. And that the tax policy is ridiculous. So it was an attempt to make tax policy into a pro-family policy. It's got a lot of opposition in the Senate. Tom will know more than I, but I've spoken to an awful lot of people who oppose it, and I don't know if it's going to pass.
Tom, the Senate does seem to be divided between deficit hawks who just want to cut spending first to get down to zero in 2002 and those who would like to have a tax cut. How do you view this in the Senate?
My view is that it's going to be tax cuts to retire the deficit first. I don't see tax cuts coming just to be tax cuts. I have a view that the $500 tax credit, and Frank touched on it, there's also a pro-life piece in it, to an anti-abortion item in it, that $500 tax credit to not have an abortion. Now that might be a stretch in some people's minds, but I think that's a factor. But no, I think that they're going to come forward with tax cuts to deficit reduction first, and then see how far it gets. They're going to drive that, coming out of the Budget Committee, just sure as shooting.
Do you support it or oppose it?
The tax cut?
Yeah.
I really have a question of whether we need a tax cut right now, or, as a matter of fact, I mean, I would definitely side with the deficit hawks. But if a tax cut is felt to be politically necessary, you know, to cut in the marginal tax rate makes a lot more sense.
Well, let me ask you this question then. If you want to stop Washington from spending so much, can't you continue to choke off the money, which makes it that much more difficult?
Well, I guess that doesn't seem to make sense when the money that you are supposedly taking away is just going to be debt financed. I mean, you're just going to borrow the difference as opposed to, you know, let's balance the budget first.
Let me ask you then another question. If it's $500, you think you can spend it better, or do you think some your congressman, whoever that is, can spend it better?
Well, sure, I can spend it better,
Then why
But-
don't you spend it?
because either I will pay it off later or my sons and daughters will pay it off later. It's not free money.
An insightful question, and thank you for bringing it up. It is one where, on the Republican side, perhaps policy analysis and politics are not completely enmeshed. I was a graduate of the Kennedy School myself in '84. As a Republican candidate, I was very much in favor of the $500 per child tax credit, which I do believe helps Americans' families. But I suppose any of us could sit down in a room for 45 minutes and come up with a bigger bang for our buck in a policy analysis situation if we wanted to do it. But let me tell you, in the next few months, the politics of this one are going to get very, very interesting, with Bob Dole, the Senate Majority Leader, sitting right in the middle of it and negotiating between those deficit hawks and those who really wanted to have the tax cut. And as a guy who's running for president, with his major opposition coming from Phil Gramm, I suppose he's going to have to swim around those rocks in the stream. Let's go over here to John.
Yeah, hello, my name's John Simon. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School, and I feel in such great company among so many Republicans. My question is, Bill Clinton has asked for a welfare reform bill to be delivered to him by July 4th. Can the panel assess both the politics of doing so, and given that it's such a complicated issue and would require, I would think, a certain amount of deliberation, the policy implications of delivering a bill so quickly to Bill Clinton?
The Republicans got absolutely hammered on school lunch programs and somewhat hammered on changing the welfare system. And the problem was that they allowed the debate to begin in economic terms, and welfare is not an economic issue. And the fact is the welfare system, when I was up here, I went twice to teach in the inner city schools. And every semester I will take two, so I'll go about 4 times a year in Washington, Philadelphia, or New York. And welfare is destructive. The system stinks. The system really does destroy families. It really does destroy hope. And it encourages a dependency. And the problem is that you've even got the people who created the system, who created the philosophy behind it. Now, in later years, they talk about how dependency wrecks the human being. And they realize what they have done. But it's such a great political issue to show that Republicans are so angry and are so mean and hurtful to people, when the system itself just encourages the wrong kind of social behavior. This is a time when the Republicans are going to get politically trashed for it. And people will feel so much better because they stood up for what's happening. Well, every year, more money goes to welfare than the year before. And every year, the amount that the individual collects from welfare is above what it was the year before. And every year, it gets worse and worse. And so Republicans have no choice. This is not an example of what is politically expedient. This is an example of what is politically detrimental. But you can't do it. You have a responsibility when you're an elected official, even if it means losing votes, to do what is right.
But so do you think they should deliver the bill by July 4th?
There's no reason for them not to.
I don't think they can. It's too much too fast. I think that was a gimmick from Clinton, setting down a deadline. He wants to sign it on July 4th in the Rose Garden. And then when it doesn't happen, he'll pound on this is the beginning of the campaign to pound on the Republican Congress to do nothing. Here I sent my great welfare reform bill up there. You know, they can't do it. The House passed the regulatory reform bill in 4 hours, and it took the Senate 4 weeks.
You don't
So-
think, just, sorry to keep going, just an issue like this, it wouldn't be a good political strategy, and if you're right, Dr. Luntz, also good policy to one-up the president and say, all right, here's our bill, take it or leave it? And you don't think the Senate could unite around that type of
Not really. When you sit there with, you still need 60 votes, it's not a majority, and you sit there with the Finance Committee sitting up to its ears in the same committee that has to handle it is sitting there doing the tax bit for the deficit reduction.
I think everything we said on welfare reform is about half right, but they're not mutual exclusives. I think the Republicans are going to get politically trashed. I don't think it's going to happen by the 4th of July, but I will go out on a limb and say welfare reform is going to pass.
Yeah.
I suspect we're going to have a welfare reform bill signed into legislation this year. It may not look like the bill the House Republicans passed, which does, let us be honest, have a flavor that has given the other side the opportunity to characterize it as punitive and harsh and a little bit cruel. And certainly the Republican senators have a very different view of what welfare reform should look like. But I think welfare reform is going to pass, and it's going to pass this year, and perhaps because we're going to be saved by the governors. The governors want this to pass. The governors want to have some leeway, some latitude to try something that works for exactly the reason that Frank brought up, which is very true. Since 1965, we've spent $4 trillion on this problem, throwing money at welfare and throwing money at poverty in this country, and we really haven't done a very good job. I think the momentum from the governors to have a change in this system, which is genuinely broken, is going to carry it through. But in the meantime, I think you're going to see Democrats hammer away at Republicans, and you're going to see the beginning of what's going to be the major theme, I suspect, for 1996, class warfare all over again, Republicans, Robin Hood in reverse. Let's go over here to the...
And also, one other thing, let me emphasize, there were no cuts. There was not a cut in the student lunch program. Pat Schroeder got up, and she talked about cuts, and every time she'd do it every day, and the Republicans would get up and challenge her. I want to know why she went running off. After she would do her floor speech, she would immediately leave the floor. She would never stay and respond when the Republicans would challenge her. There were no cuts to the student lunch program. The program will go up by 4.5% next year, which is actually higher, marginally higher than what Clinton wanted the next year's increase to be. But you wouldn't know that from what you've seen on television. That is a fact, but that's not what's reported, and that's not what the Democrats claim. And if we all want to sit together, and I think most of you would probably say, to hell with partisan politics. I don't want to hear about contracts, don't want to hear about Republicans, don't want to hear about Democrats. I just want something done for the good of the country. How do you do it when your enemies are lying? It's a very, very tough thing to do. And that's what's going on in Washington right now. An ugliness that, in my few years in D.C., I've never seen.
Let's go over here.
Hi, my name is William Zerhouni. I'm with the Harvard-Radcliffe Republican Alliance. And Mr. Luntz, I'm glad to see that you could get a better reception tonight than you did back in October. You were facing a tough crowd, and you come back the victor, and my hat's tipped in your direction for that. My question tonight deals basically with entitlements, and Mr. Shaw, you and I have talked about this earlier, but it seems that before there used to be a principled conservative stand against things such as Social Security. In 1964, Barry Goldwater said about Social Security, quote, "If a man doesn't want it, let him provide his own." And needless to say, that wasn't tremendously popular. In 1981, President Reagan tried to have some Social Security reform passed through the Senate, and he was beaten back 96-0. As Tip O'Neill said, Social Security has become almost like the third rail of American politics. You touch it and you die. But it seems that more and more these days, we are going to have to deal with entitlements. As the Congressional Research Service said in 1994, mandatory spendings and entitlements took up 63.1% of the federal budget. By 1998, if I recall correctly, that's supposed to go up to 69%. And with the baby boomer generation coming on, the payroll taxes and Social Security taxes are necessarily going to have to go up if we are going to finance the type of Social Security benefits that we're used to giving out today. Now, it seems that many people in America don't like to talk about cutting back entitlements because that's middle-class pork or that's upper-class welfare, however people want to see it. But the fact remains that many people receive things like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, well, not Medicaid, but Social Security, who don't financially and economically need it. My question is, will the Republican Party ever regain the principled conservative stand against things such as entitlements? And if we do, is there a way that we can make this palatably acceptable to the public so that we can really get to cutting the budget back and the deficit back to zero by the year 2002?
Hard question. Will my colleagues who don't want to run for the United States Congress want to take on Social Security?
It's easy for us to talk about Social Security, but boy, they have been burned and burned and burned. Every time you say something, Tip was right. The Democrats jump up and down. They're going to stop Social Security. The mailing begins, and it started in the House. And Frank can tell you what happened in the House when that vote was up. So they've become very skittish about it. They've become nervous, except for one thing. This year could be a chance, better probably than many other years, for this to happen, because those guys and gals that got elected from the House, especially those 87, are not going to be permanent fixtures in this town. They don't give a damn. Full speed ahead, and we're going to try and do all this politically. Whether they got the guts and the courage to do it in the Senate, I don't think so. They get absolutely nervous. Yeah, indeed, the 33 that are running will be let loose to do their own thing. But whether, I don't know. I can see Clinton vetoing a Social Security tax cut on television and handing out veto pens with honor, given the political nature of that issue. I'm not sure that they have the courage to do it.
Your generation is extremely cynical about the future of Social Security. We did a poll for the third millennium. For those of you who are between the ages of 18 and 34, there are more people in that age group that believe in the existence of UFOs than believe that Social Security will exist when they retire.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're right about one of those, but I know that they're probably right about the other. And for those of you who are in your teens or 20s, through some of the work I've done, I've seen the budget numbers. And even if you are a Democrat, as I know our next questioner is, man, your future is so screwed. And I feel sorry for you. Even if you're voting to do it to yourself, I really do feel sorry for you, because your tax rates are going to be through the roof. And you've no one to blame but yourselves.
Last point on Social Security. We're going to go through a budget round this year, and I think the next 2 or 3 years, that puts this country on a path to a balanced budget that is zero by the year 2002, and it will be done without touching Social Security. Having said that, lurking behind that, and I don't think the policymakers have necessarily realized this yet, and a lot of the Budget Committee members I've talked to haven't quite figured this out yet. Right now, you're getting a bump because you got $75 billion surplus annually sitting in those trust funds, and you get a little leeway out of it. However, that does change in the next century. Actually, in the year 2008, those big surpluses in the Social Security Trust Fund all of a sudden go negative big time or real quickly. So there isn't any question that even if we put ourselves on a path to zero now for 2002, as we get on the other side of the year 2000, no one can really avoid the Social Security question, because the annual deficits in that fund, which will eventually deplete that fund in the year 2030 for those who are going to retire, are a serious budget question to be addressed. So it can only be sort of avoided for so long. We only have time for about 2 more questions. Let's go.
Hi, my name is David Yarkin. I'm a senior at Harvard Radcliffe, and I'd like to congratulate you, Frank, for not only successes in the last 2 years, but also for dressing better than I've ever seen you dress before. I'm the Penn student.
Did you switch? Are you here now?
Yeah, I transferred.
Oh, you're stepping up in the world.
Well, that notwithstanding. 3 years ago, when I asked you if Bill Clinton would win the presidency, you said, quote, not a shot in hell. Between then and now, there was a Republican convention.
Yeah, the difference between Clinton and I was that I inhaled.
That night, or?
Wait a minute, you got a president here that when a student asked him
Can I ask my
whether
question?
he wore briefs or boxers, his answer was, his exact words were usually boxers. Your president can't give a straight answer on what underwear he wears. How can we get a straight answer about what drugs he does?
Well,
I'm sure there's a question.
there's a
There's
question. Between your possibly drug-induced answer. And today, there was a Republican convention in which Marilyn Quayle, Pat Robertson, and Pat Buchanan each gave a family values, very violent speech on the floor of the convention in prime time. There was also a very, very strong, adamant pro-life plank in the platform. Ralph Reed said a few months ago that he would not, that Christian Republicans would not accept a pro-life president or a pro-life Republican nominee. Given the fact that the majority of America is pro-choice, and a lot of people say that at least some of the blame for the Republican defeat in '92 lays with that convention. Can you predict what kind of a convention we'll see as far as abortion in 1996, Professor Lentz?
I wish I could, and I can't. All I will say about '92 is that you now have Atlantic Monthly, Time Magazine, Candace Bergen herself, all saying that actually, in many ways, Dan Quayle was right. Donna Shalala, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton saying what Dan Quayle said about families was right, even though they beat the hell out of him in 1992 for it. So what goes around comes around. I certainly hope, as a Republican, that it is not divisive, that they don't tear each other apart. I'm searching and I'm hoping that people like Jack Kemp and Bill Bennett will find the way, and Bill Kristol, so that we do not tear ourselves apart. Because for Republicans, abortion is our third rail, just as for Democrats, affirmative action is.
The question is, though, will Christian conservatives allow it to become a non-issue, or they press the issue? Like,
I think what happened in '94 will probably happen in '96, which is provided that the position the Republicans take is not hostile to their beliefs, that there's more that unites them in their disappointment with the president than divides them between themselves and other Republicans.
thanks.
Let's take one last question over here.
My name is Avery Martin, and I'm a first-year student and a member of the Republican caucus here at the school. As you've pointed out, the contract with America has been an incredible instrument of change, not only for the issues that it addressed, but because it served to completely unify the Republican Party, at least for the time being. I'm curious as to what you think will happen to the Republican Party in Congress now that the pressure of the first 100 days is over, now that the contract of America has been satisfied.
It's an excellent question. It's an excellent question from a politics standpoint, but also from a political science standpoint. Because what you saw happen in 1995 is something you haven't seen happen in America for a very long time. Very cohesive political parties. Political parties that stand for something and vote together. It's almost more akin to the British model with a party program and then party voting once in the legislature than it is in sort of the American fragmented individual special interests system. So it is a bit of a change. But the question is, where does it go from here? And Tom and Frank, I'll give you both an opportunity to address it. And Frank, perhaps also what the polls have shown in terms of what the American people think about Congress and how it's changed in these last 4 months. And last thoughts that you have about the contract with America and what the next year portends. Tom?
Well, in the first place, the contract, the way you've read about it in the media, and I'm getting into Frank's business, the media has been going one way, and the American people in America has been going another way. USA Today on April 1st, I guess. Reservations aside, voters standing by the Republicans. Republicans, good mark for the first 100 days. A poll. Most say the agenda can succeed. So regardless of what you read, the contract caught on, and they like it out there. And politicians tend to like what voters do, and they will follow that. So great pieces of this contract in certain forms and others and some revisions and what have you will pass. It's going to take some time. It's not going to happen in 100 days. It's not going to happen in 200 days. But a year from today, if we're here, and the Republicans have passed a good piece of this, and if the president starts vetoing some of these things, the Republicans I don't think they can override them, but in the end, the president has to be a player if he wants to. Is he going to turn right? Is he going to turn left? Is he going to go up to Dole and Gingrich and start making deals, or is he going to turn to his? That's going to be the decision he makes and where he runs. Is he going to go run as a liberal, or is he going to run as a moderate? And that's a decision that they're going to have to make downtown as these bills start popping in on him. But I think the Democrats in the Senate are going to try and protect him. They've already started it. Try and keep stuff from going down there to him to prevent him from doing embarrassing vetoes. And we did that for years as a minority, so it's going to be a very difficult thing for a lot of the contract to pass in the form that came from the House.
Frank, this is that thing, that piece of paper that the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, always pulls out of his pocket. And as you know, in putting it together, the big theory behind this was accountability, that this was put in TV guide throughout America so that American voters could actually check off once it happens. Did it work? What does that accountability show, and what does it mean for the Republican Party as we go from here?
Congress briefly had newfound popularity where it was at a 5-year high in credibility and support that has fallen back since then. There's never been such a great difference between the Republican and Democratic parties in attitudes. To be precise and accurate, it's not that the GOP is doing so well, it's that the Democrats are doing so badly. For those of you who are Democrats here, the good news is that Americans have only 1% higher rating of the GOP today than they did on Election Day. The bad news for you is that they have a 17% lower rating for the Democrats today than on Election Day. If you are a Democrat and you're feeling good about your party and you're up here, figure out if there are maybe 50 people in here, there are only 5 people who share that opinion with you. That there has never been so much animosity towards the ideology and the positions of that party than exists right now. And so what you're going to have on the Democratic side is a complete revolution internally in your own party. Kind of sit down and get your act together and decide what you believe in, rather than playing negative politics. There are 3 points I wanted to mention about the contract in closing. Number 1, Bill Clinton's name was never mentioned. Number 2, the Democratic Party's name was never mentioned. And number 3, nothing negative was ever mentioned. The amazing thing about the contract was it was the most positive, proactive, issue-oriented document that either party has put out in the modern political era. Contrast that with the way the president campaigned in the last 2 months of 1994, and you've got the difference between the 2 political parties. I apologize for not being an intellectual and not being a policy expert. I wish I could wax eloquent like Newt Gingrich or Jack Kemp could do so here. I am merely someone who gauges public opinion. I'm optimistic because I think we've turned the corner on skepticism and cynicism, but there's a long way to go because this country had sunk so deeply. I've never been prouder to be a Republican because I'm watching the people that I work for stand up for things in a positive fashion that they believe in and that they are keeping their promises. And I think that we have a lot of opportunity, both Republicans and Democrats, to work together to make serious changes. We certainly have to, and it's certainly taken us way too long to get to this point. But we're here now, and things are changing for the better. And so for those of you Republicans who are probably pretty hard-pressed at this institution, my hat's off to you for standing up for what you believe in. And you should know that there are plenty of people in Washington just like you, standing up to the media, standing up to the special interest groups, and practicing what they preach.
With my apologies for the fact that we have run out of time, I want to thank you all for participating in our program, and certainly thank Frank Luntz and Tom Korologos for joining us tonight. Thank you. Real late, right?
Good job. I appreciate your Good luck. I had my worm as the audience
Frank,
kissed
thank
us the
you.
whole time.
Thank you very much.
But I'm glad we did hear it.